We get a pretty good look at the Cafe Nervosa coffee mugs this week, but we can't quite read the text, even at 1080p. Hello, and welcome to the 22nd installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. This episode of Frasier is entitled Author Author, and originally aired on May 5th, 1994, returning to air after taking the last 2 weeks off. I'm not sure what the reason for taking the week of the 21st off is, but last week Seinfeld had a 2-part episode that aired back-to-back, which is why Frasier was bumped off that spot for that week. I've plugged that double episodes rating into the last 2 spots in the ratings chart, since Frasier aired for 2 weeks without Seinfeld. This week's Frasier attracted 26.2 million viewers, a nice bump of 0.7 million from last week, and just under the season average of 26.375 million viewers. At the same time, Seinfeld saw a decline of 2 million viewers from their double episode last week, coming in at just 1.4 million viewers above Frasier. This is another of those rare weeks where Frasier went up while Seinfeld went down. Last week we had what in 1998 was John Mahoney's favorite episode. This week we have David Hyde Pierce's favorite episode. We'll get to Jane Leaves in Season 2, Grammar's in Season 4, and Gilpin's won't be until Season 5. Author Author is, of course, a James Burrows directed episode. On writing duties this week, we have newcomers Don Siegel and Jerry Perzigian. This pair is interesting because, unlike our previous writing duos, these two aren't really known for working together. In fact, this is the only episode of the series the pair will write, but the first of 2 episodes Siegel will write. Both of these writers have a lot of Hollywood history, just not necessarily in the writing department. In the case of Perzigian, he's best known as an executive producer. And boy, has he executive produced. He's been an executive producer since the 80s, starting with seasons 9 through 11 of The Jeffersons, before he went on to be a producer for The Golden Girls, Bob, Malcolm and Eddie, Cousin Skeeter, and The Best Damn Sports Show period. Post-2010, he's moved to Moscow to work on the Russian version of Married with Children. Don Siegel, not to be confused with Don Siegel, who directed Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Dirty Harry, is not quite as prolific a writer or producer as Perzigian. He was also a producer on The Jeffersons and The Golden Girls, but while Perzigian continued to act as an executive producer for a lot of shows, Siegel was pretty much retired from the Hollywood business by 1992. He wrote a handful of scripts for television episodes, including the 2 aforementioned episodes of Frasier, post-1992, but for the most part, he was done after a stint as a producer on Golden Girls. We start out with the Elevator and the Space Needle this week, making its 6th appearance in the series. It's now clear we aren't going to have a nice, even rotation of intros for the last 2 episodes of the season. At this point, we have 4 Nothing Happening intros, 5 Lights All Over Seattle, 6 Elevators in the Space Needle, and 7 of the Red Blinking Dot. We start out our episode with a guest star, but not a guest caller. This guest star is actually more of a recurring bit character, with Luck Hari as the waitress. This is the first of 11 appearances she'll make in the show as the nameless Cafe Nervosa worker. She'll continue to appear during the next 3 seasons of the series. This is an early role for Hari. In fact, it's actually the 4th credited role she's had. She scored her first role a mere year before this, on an episode of Bob, which both of our writers worked as producers on, which may have led to her appearance here. Following her role on Frasier, she'd become a bit of a "that girl who was in that thing" actress, with one-off appearances on a number of shows, including Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Ally McBeal, ER, 6 Feet Under, Everybody Loves Raymond, and Nip Tuck. She'd retired from television acting in 2007, following an appearance in the indie film The Memory Thief. Hurry's appearance is interesting, and the joke she sets up involving Frasier's usual at the cafe is pretty funny. But she's far from the most interesting guest star to show up in this scene. Our second guest star in this scene is Niles' agent, Sam Tanaka, played by Makoto Iwamatsu, or Mako, as he's more commonly known. Mako was born in Japan in 1933. At the age of 6, his parents, who were political dissidents, moved to the United States. Once across the ocean, Mako grew to love America and joined the army, where he discovered he had a passion for acting. Shortly after this, his acting career really took off, and he's been in a ton of things. In fact, his career shot off with a bang. In 1962, with only his second credited role, he received an Oscar nomination for his role in the film The Sand Pebbles. From there, he's gone on to be in an exorbitant amount of television and movie roles, including 9 episodes of McHale's Navy, The Time Tunnel, Columbo, 4 episodes of MASH, Magnum, P.I., and The A-Team. He's also had recurring roles in a number of animated features, including Dexter's Lab, Samurai Jack, and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Sadly, he passed from cancer in 2006. Despite never winning an Oscar or receiving a nomination after his role in Sand Pebbles, Mako has contributed to a ton of cinema and a handful of video games. We get a pretty good look at the Cafe Nervosa coffee mugs this week, but we can't quite read the text, even at 1080p. The good news is, I was able to figure out what they say. Here's a high-quality picture from someone on the Frasier Reddit who owns a set. These are Pasquinini mugs. One side just says Pasquinini, while the other says, for music, Puccini, for art, Bernini, for espresso, Pasquinini. Puccini is a reference to Giacomo Puccini, who is widely regarded as one of the greatest opera composers of all time. Among his works is Tosca, which Niles mentions as one of his favorites just a few episodes ago. Bernini is a reference to Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who is considered the Shakespeare of sculpture, and has sculpted a ton of sculptures you've probably seen before, including this very famous one of David. Pasquini is obviously a coffee company. They generally make espresso machines. They were founded in 1957 in LA by Ambrose Pasquini, and quickly became one of the biggest names in the high-quality coffee market. I'm guessing the cups came with the espresso machines ordered for the sets, but it works just as well for ones that could actually show up in Cafe Nervosa, as Pasquini seems like the kind of machine Frasier and Niles would prefer to frequent. We get another interesting tidbit from this scene where we learn Frasier and Niles wrote a musical together for the prep school they attended. I'm not surprised in the least they attended prep school, seemingly at their mother's insistence, but this is the first time we've actually learned this background tidbit about them. It fits nicely with the characters, and the idea of Niles and Frasier working together on a musical is fantastic. In the next scene, we find Daphne is missing from the apartment, while Frasier and Niles begin work on their book. Niles' laptop is a compact LTE-286. This is one of the first notebook-sized computers ever built, and was released in 1989. It included both a floppy drive and a built-in hard drive, making it one of the most complete and powerful portable computers available at its release. I'm a bit of a computer nerd. If you're not, feel free to skip ahead here, but I'm going to go into a little bit of the specs here. Assuming this is the highest end version of the LTE-286, it contained a 40 megabyte hard drive, about a quarter the size of a high-quality music album today, an 8.8-inch screen, 640 kilobytes of RAM. For comparison, most low-end smartphones have at least 3,000 times more RAM, and a 12 megahertz processor. Again, even the lowest of low-end smartphones are at least 500 times faster than this. Granted, it only ran DOS, so the demands weren't really that demanding, especially compared to what we have today. The only thing I find a little bit odd about this laptop is, unlike Niles' phone, This one isn't the newest or top of the line. It came out somewhere between 1989 and 1991, making it, at a minimum, 3 years old at the time of this episode. With that said, it held a price tag of around $5,000, so it's possible even the Cranes couldn't afford to upgrade to the newest model every year. If your eyes glazed over during the last part, I apologize. But we're back to the meat of the episode. Frasier and Niles decide to use Frasier's radio show to gather information for their proposed book, and we get to see some nice power play happening between Roz and Frasier. Ultimately, since Frasier is the face of the radio show, the voice, he gets his way, but it's really nice to see some bickering back and forth between him and Roz. In the past, when there's been something disagreeable, I'm primarily thinking of the Christmas episode here, Roz has just gone along with it without putting up much of a fight. I like seeing her kick back against Frasier a bit here. The only other notable bit from this scene is we have a guest caller right in the middle of the episode. It's sort of weird narrative-wise, as they usually show up at the beginning, but I'm not complaining. The guest caller this week is Oscar nominee Christina Lahti. Lahti is an actress I'm not personally familiar with, but she's done a lot of work. Her acting career started in the 70s, with a series of commercials in New York, before scoring a few TV spots in 1978 and a role in the 1979 Al Pacino film And Justice for All. From there, she'd score an Oscar nomination for the 1984 film Swing Shift. Throughout the rest of the 80s and first half of the 90s, she'd do a lot of movies, both theatrical and made for TV, including Running on Empty and Pie in the Sky. In 1995, she took a starring role in 97 episodes of Chicago Hope, missing both the first and final season of the show. Since then, she's had a couple of recurring television roles, including on Jack and Bobby, Law and Order SVU, The Blacklist, and Evil. Frasier and Niles head to a hotel room to attempt to bang out the first few chapters of their book. This is the second time we've seen a hotel room in the series, the prior being Lilith's hotel room, back in The Show Where Lilith Comes Back. And my hat's off to the set designers here. It doesn't look like they reused anything from Lilith's hotel room for this scene. I'm not sure if this is just a dated reference or one I just wasn't that familiar with. But Niles tells Frasier he's mixing metaphors like a Cuisinart. A Cuisinart is a mixture of the words cuisine and art, and was a brand of food processor which became popular in the 80s. Apparently at one time it was considered an interchangeable term with food processor, like Kleenex and bathroom tissue. I've personally never used the term, and I've always referred to the device as a food processor. But I'm not certain if that's just a me thing or a dated aspect of the show. Either way, it was an interesting tidbit from my perspective. We've seen Frasier in disheveled looks before, but not Niles. This episode we get a couple more interesting wardrobe choices for the psychiatrist. I was surprised last week to see him in suspenders for the first time, but we see him wearing them again here, which makes me think he usually wears them under his jacket. And we just haven't seen him without a jacket too often before. We also get to see Niles wearing a V-neck. This seems extremely appropriate to me. If I would have guessed any male cast members were V-neckers, it was Niles. The other thing in this shot I absolutely love is Frasier drinking the tiny whiskey while lying down. There's a few lines about him drinking, but just as a background gag, this is great and very funny. My hat's off to the writers or Burroughs or Grammer for whoever made this call. The scene ends with us getting a really good fight between the brothers. I like this a lot. As someone who has a brother, this feels very realistic. And you really believe Grammer and David Hyde Pierce are actually siblings here. During the fight, we also learn two other nice pieces of biographical information. The first is that their mother is also a psychiatrist. Boy, I would love to see a flashback episode with her and Martin interacting. And the second is Frasier was in fact married first, giving us a pretty good timeline for just how long Niles and Maris have been together. We wrap the episode up with Daphne finally showing up to act as an exposition box for Martin. to explain how he manipulated his children into not fighting with each other anymore. It's a wrap to the plot line, it does the emotional beats well enough, and it works. I'm just not sure I loved it. The coda scene this week feels way off from the rest of the episode. It's just Eddie jumping and being ridiculous, but I really liked it. We've never seen Eddie do a trick this active before, and it makes me think he could have been Air Bud instead of whatever that dog's name was. We've finally got some new ties for Frasier this week, after almost 2 months without one. This week, both of Frasier's ties are new. It is the first time he's had a new tie since episode 14, and the first time he's had 2 since episode 9. Niles also sports 2 new ties this week, with the third making its 4th appearance on the show, after last showing up in episode 15. This leaves Niles 1 tie ahead of Frasier at 23 to 24 ties thus far in the series. I can understand why this was David Hyde Pierce's favorite episode, as he's got a lot of fun things to do here. But it feels weaker for some of the other characters, particularly Daphne. The overall plot here is good, and it's a real treat getting to see Frasier and Niles work together. They really feel like brothers here, more so than they have in past episodes, and their on-screen chemistry just really works. The only weakness between them, plotline-wise, is the story wraps up a bit too easily. I don't actually have an opinion on what would have made this ending stronger, but I feel something slightly different may have flowed better. Both our guest stars are a lot of fun. Mako is a genuine star, and awesome to have on, even if just for this one episode. And Hari's dry wit is really funny, and I'm excited to see more of her antics over the next 3 seasons. Roz, Martin, and Eddie all do just enough to keep them busy, but never enough to take the eyes off Frasier and Niles' starring roles in this episode. The only person who really feels left out here is Daphne. Yes, she shows up at the end and has her nice little scene with Martin, but it really feels more like an afterthought. It's as though the writers thought, oh crud, we forgot to write Daphne into this episode, and hurried up and tacked her in there at the very end. This complaint aside, this is a strong episode, and I'd say it's on par with John Mahoney's favorite episode last week. All the actors and guest actors are at the top of their game. Frasier and Niles singing is a delight. Grammer gets in that hilarious background drinking gag, and we learn a lot of interesting biographical information about the Crane family this week. If you want to learn the motherlode of new info on the Crane's past, give this 7.5 out of 10 episode of Frasier a watch.